Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. In 1838, Georgetown University sold 272 slaves, and the money raised helped to secure the future of what is now one of the US's leading academic institutions. Almost 200 years later, the university has promised to make amends for its links to slavery by offering, among other things, preferential admissions to the descendants of those slaves. It's one of the most decisive acts of its kind in a country where the roots of slavery can still be traced in all parts of society. Our newsmaker today is Georgetown University, as we ask if it's going far enough to make up for its past.
We must acknowledge that Georgetown University participated in the institution of slavery.
An apology for the sins of its forefathers. After more than 170 years, Georgetown University has said sorry for its links to slavery.
This original evil that shaped the early years of the Republic was present here, and we have been able to hide from this truth, bury this truth, ignore and deny this truth.
The university says it is now seeking forgiveness, in particular from the descendants of 272 slaves it sold in 1838 to help pay off its debts. As part of its penance, it says it will create an institute to study the history of slavery at the school, rename 2 buildings that had honoured university presidents who oversaw the sale of the slaves, and give the descendants the same admission preference as the children of faculty, staff and alumni. Georgetown is going further than other US universities in confronting its past links to slavery. But for some, it's not far enough. For some of the descendants of the sold slaves, Georgetown's attempt to atone falls short.
It seems to me that the best title for it would be Georgetown Reconciles with Itself, because it really is all about Georgetown and has very little to do with us descendants.
They argue the sale of their ancestors ensured the university's survival, and giving financial help or scholarships to their descendants is the least the university could do. Georgetown's apology follows protests in universities across the United States earlier this year. Black students protesting against systemic racial inequality at universities, built on the back of black slaves. Is this apology from Georgetown a step in the right direction for healing the wrongs of history? Or is this a gesture that is merely symbolic? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Nottingham in the UK is Christopher Phelps, an Associate Professor of American History at the University of Nottingham. Mr. Phelps, thanks a lot for joining us. So Georgetown University made more than $3 billion from the sale in today's money. Is that maybe the price they should have paid if this was going to be more than just a symbolic gesture?
Well, what you're pointing to is that slavery, which we now think of as oppression, as wrong, as morally incomprehensible, was an economic system first and foremost. It was a form of labor exploitation, labor extraction. It was unpaid labor, and it was the direct ownership of human beings. So this sale, which strikes us as wrong, is one aspect of what Georgetown did. It also used slave labor in building some of the buildings on its campuses. And whether this is enough, I'm not sure it's my personal place to judge this. They've had a process on the campus which the descendants of the slaves themselves felt could have been more inclusive of them, because the commission that was chartered to undertake this determination of what the institution could do to make up for this moral wrong was absent any member of the families of those who were directly descendant from the slaves that are sold. So one thing they could have done is in their process actually given power and voice and representation to those families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they could have been more inclusive, I guess. So to what extent do you believe that this might have an impact on contemporary racial tensions in the United States? So you have the Trump phenomenon, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, and then on campuses themselves, campuses are quite divided. We saw situations in Mizzou, at Yale, issues of race, safe spaces, and so on. Might this be a starting point to a better conversation?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a process unfolding in the United States. Around 2014 is when the Black Lives Matter movement took off around police brutality and killings of unarmed black men in communities. And then over the next several years, that spilled into youth who were coming onto campuses, deciding to take up such issues on their campuses. And in so doing, they're pressing these causes at Yale, at Princeton, at Harvard. They're asking for buildings to be renamed, for racist symbols to be removed, at Oxford University in the UK as well, where Cecil Rhodes' statue was a controversial matter. And so all over the world, really, and this includes South Africa, students are asking for these symbols of the white supremacist past and these institutional wrongdoings to be rectified in some way, for there to be a historical process of reparations. And yes, I think it's significant that Georgetown is taking this step. It may be criticized for not being enough. For instance, they're giving preferential treatment in admissions to the descendants of these slaves, but they haven't offered to provide funds for those students to then study. So, you know, we're offering a $70,000 a year education preference for people who might not have the ability to pay for such an education. They could have made a financial commitment to the education.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's, you know, it's not a scholarship, it's not a bursary. It's just putting you sort of, I guess, at the front of the line if you qualify, right? It's just like being a teacher's kid or something like that. I wonder, is this going to reopen the question of public reparations? Because this is very different. You have an individual private institution almost, you know, sitting in confession and going, I want to cleanse myself. It's almost like maybe a corrupt businessman giving charity, right? But then there's a separate issue of public reparations on a federal level or national level, the government coming in and saying, hey, to fix the injustices of the past, we need to take this money or whatever, or opportunities, and give it to people who didn't have this opportunity in the past. Is that going to be on the table now?
Oh, I think it most definitely should be on the table, and then it's an incredibly complex issue. The entirety of American society really was built on this unpaid labor, and it's one of the main reasons why there's such deep-seated racial inequality in the United States. African Americans have almost no net worth. That is, their savings measured against their debt comes out at about zero, compared to white households having something in the range of $70,000 to $100,000 net worth. And that's a direct result of centuries of slavery, followed by centuries of Jim Crow racial segregation, all of which was meant to keep African Americans in a secondary status and make it easier to pay them a lot less than their labor was worth. And how the whole society does that, but it can't just happen on an institutional level. Georgetown itself can't rectify that. It gets at the very basis of American history, which was the paradox of a democratic republic that was simultaneously a slaveholders' republic. So there's a national conversation unfolding about race. Unfortunately, much of it is retrograde in the form of Donald Trump's contributions. But the students at Georgetown and elsewhere who have compelled these changes should be saluted, and let's hope they go farther.
Yeah, but as you say, it's almost impossible to implement if you do it on a national level in terms of public reparations. The question is, who gets to decide, and how far does it go? Do you give the land back to the Native Americans?
There's a whole can of worms, and there are many people who have written on this. Actually, before slavery was even abolished, there were African Americans raising the idea of reparations. It's a very old idea. And what's interesting about our moment is that certain institutions are taking measure of themselves and trying to square their history morally. If the country could do that, and you're right, there's absolutely no one plan that might satisfy everyone, and exactly how to go about it, there are probably multiple good ways, but the country could do considerably more than it has at present.
How would you respond to someone who says, okay, we cannot be responsible for the crimes of our ancestors. We're a democracy now. Everybody starts off on an equal footing, all things considered. Let's do our best to build a future. Let's look forward and let's not look back.
Right. Well, that's an understandable reaction. And I think that the point is not to hold any white person in a kind of criminal sense responsible for slavery. What's being asked is not some sort of punitive measure. What's being asked is some kind of redemptive justice for historical crimes that have created present-day inequities. And I think that there's a reasonable kind of moral conversation that can go on about this, and it might be a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
But I think there's given slavery's magnitude, just as we look at something like the Holocaust, I think, and Germany has tried in various ways to come to reconciliation about that and truth. And look at South Africa's process about apartheid and the truth and reconciliation process. And there can be a truth and reconciliation process in America about race.
Yeah. Final question for you, just from a purely historical perspective. I had 2 young girls in the US public school system for a while, and history, from my perspective, was taught to them very much in this sort of linear way, where one day Abraham Lincoln gave a speech at Gettysburg, and he was killed, and many years later, you had Rosa Parks went to the front of a bus, MLK gave a speech, JFK was killed, Barack Obama was elected as president, and there's this sort of sweeping mega events in a linear way, all sort of progressing along. And just the mere fact that there were these Jesuits who owned and sold slaves in Georgetown in 1838 is a fascinating historical story there. Is this an opportunity for Americans to dig a bit deeper in their own history?
One would hope. I mean, what you're expressing there is the classic frustration of the professional historian like me, actually, which is that if you read American history as it's now written by historians, it's much more about social life and popular history. The slaves were freeing themselves. That's why Abraham Lincoln had to pass the Emancipation Proclamation. As the Union lines were advancing south, slaves were coming off the plantations in effectively a general strike against the plantation labor they'd been subjected to, and running into the Union lines, which then had to face the consequence. Do we return these slaves to their owners because we respect private property law, or do we call them contraband of war and decide that they're part of the enemy's rebellion and we're not going to return them? And they ended up doing the latter, which then compelled the Emancipation Proclamation. So the reason slaves were freed was not because Abraham Lincoln had a good idea, but because the slaves themselves acted on it. And yes, time and again, we have these moments where people start attending to history and they realize that it's beneath the surface of the heroes and the superficial events that we use to kind of shorthand history, and that's understandable. And some people really are heroic and they play a kind of breakthrough moment role. But the history is complex, and the country is, it's not just a celebratory history that should make Americans feel easy and happy about their history. It's a complex one in which there's a lot to owe up to.
Christopher Phelps, good to talk to you. Thank you very much.